Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our Bible Ponder for this week. This is the third in our series on biblical interpretation. The first episode was kind of an intro and overview of kind of what I wanted to cover and talk about, with links to a couple of resources. The second video was all about one of the most important things in biblical interpretation, and that is context. Looking at not just what's around the verse that you're looking at, but the book it's in and even its historical setting. So if you want to check that out, find the videos. They're all on Facebook or YouTube. You can pretty easily go back under our playlists for Bible Ponder and rewatch those first two videos and check out the resources that are linked there as well. Today, I want to talk a bit about method, and hopefully this video won't quite be as long as our one about context, but we'll see how we get on. So one of the things that really determines our interpretation of a text and what you're actually going to get out of a text when you read it is the method you use. And some of that is in whether you're using a sort of critical method and actually looking at context or whether you're not. But what I really mean is kind of what you're going in with is what you're going to get out of it. So what do I mean by this? Well, I think the first and most common way that we look at the Bible and what we're trying to get out of it is moral application. Something to do with our ethics, our morals, how we live our lives. So I've kind of, in the way I've structured this, I think of moral application as sort of 1A and 1B. The first moral application that we often go into the Bible to look for is, what about myself? How should I live my life? And so sometimes that means we read a text about David or Daniel or Jesus or Paul, and we read ourselves into that text, and we try and pull out some sort of moral truth. And sometimes that question is whether the character in the story is doing something that we should do, or whether they're doing something that we actually shouldn't do. But in either case, we're often going in looking for something to tell ourselves about how to live our lives. And the second side, the 1B of moral application, is what the world should or shouldn't do. It's sort of that same thing, but on a grander scale, sort of talking about the wider world and what does the church or the Bible have to say to everybody about how to live. And so often we go into text looking for that, and that can be appropriate a lot of times, but we have to be careful because sometimes that's really not what the Bible text that we're looking at is actually intending to do. So there's a phrase that you have to look for, the aim, the AIM, the author's intended meaning. Because sometimes, it is about moral instruction. Or if it's a story that's not necessarily that, we can still glean some kind of moral idea from it. If it's a story about David and Bathsheba, that might just be presented to us as, this is a story about David. But there are some moral things we can glean from that, if that makes sense. But the thing is, that's not always appropriate, and we can get ourselves into trouble if we're looking at a story and trying to glean something moral out of it that's not there. And we can end up coming out with kind of wacky morals if we're trying to moralize everything. So that's the 1A and 1B of moral application. So sort of the number 2 is this text trying to give us historical understanding? Is it telling us about what ancient Israel was like, or what life in the ancient Near East is like in the New Testament, especially around Israel or Galilee and all of these sorts of places? Like, what are we learning historically? Sometimes that's a perfectly adequate thing to get out of a text. It doesn't have to give us some kind of great moral pronouncement. It doesn't have to do anything else other than tell us something, teach us a little bit about history. The flip side of this coin is, are we trying to read history into every part of the Bible? A lot of the Bible has a lot of really solid historical footing, and we've learned actually quite a lot about history by having the documents of the Bible, these ancient texts that have been passed down generation to generation, have offered a treasure trove of historical knowledge. But at the same time, not every story in the Bible is written to be 100% historically accurate. And that can be true of stories that did historically happen, but they're presented and written in a way that's a bit massaged to tell the story. We do that all the time in our own lives anyway. We shouldn't be bothered by that. But there are also other stories in the Bible that aren't historical stories, and they're not meant to be read as historical stories. The author, again, if we're looking for author's intended meaning, the author never ever meant us to take them as historical narrative lessons. They're there to teach us something, or to tell us the story of God, or to be metaphorical, or in some sense, we've got to kind of suss that out when we come across it. But if we go into it assuming and thinking every single thing has to be 100% historically accurate, we're going to end up in a weird place in terms of interpretation. So that's the kind of second thing. And the third and final thing that we can go into a text looking for is something devotional or educational. And I differentiate this from kind of the moral application, because that's usually something to do with our lives and what we're going to do. You know, should I go here? Should I not go here? Should I care for this person, or should I care for myself? These are kind of practical moral decisions. With kind of devotional or educational, we can learn something spiritually, we can learn something that grows us or grows our church, or we can just learn about the story of God. We can learn just about what God is doing in the world and has done in the world, and then we can start to look for how God works in our world. So that's sort of a different thing, I think, the moral kind of understanding for us of the world. It's a devotional, educational aspect. And so when you're looking at a text, depending on what method you're using, so what you're going in to find, it's going to skew what you come out of. That leads us to our example text. And this is one of my favorite texts in the Bible. Whenever anyone asks you what your favorite passage of the Bible is, some people have really lovely, genuine answers. Mine are tricky because often it depends on my mood or what season of life I'm in. But there's this little passage is one of my favorites because it's so weird. So let's use this as an example of how what we go in with will change what we come out with. And this text is in 2 Kings chapter 2, verses 23 to 25, just those three short verses. So let's read the story about the prophet Elisha. He, being Elisha, went up from there to Bethel. And while he was going up on the way, some small boys came out of the city and jeered at him, saying, "Go away, bald head! Go away, bald head!" When he turned around and saw them, he cursed them in the name of the Lord. Then two she-bears, female bears, don't know why it needs to be that specific, came out of the woods and mauled 42 of the boys. From there he went on to Mount Carmel and returned to Samaria. What an interesting text we have. So let's look at it, looking at it through our lenses. So if we're looking at this, trying to find some kind of moral application, what are we going to come out with? Well, we could come out with, don't jeer your elders. That could be a moral application, surely. You know, these youths are teasing Elisha for being bald, and he calls out bears, and presumably God approves of this, because how could he do miracles outside of the power of God? So God certainly approves of Elisha punishing these youths for mocking him as their elder. But is that necessarily in the text? There are plenty of texts in the Bible where we could talk about respecting our elders, obeying your parents, all of those things. We don't need that in this text. It's kind of fishing for something. And if you try and even widen it out to the world, what does this say to the world? Are we going to try and force something into this text for a moral application to the world? What about a historical understanding? Are we going to try and demand that this story is strictly true historically? And then we get into a discussion of miracles and what are miracles and how are they possible, that Elisha did this? But even going back to kind of the moral application of it, was it right for Elisha to do this? I mean, the bears maul 42 kids. Surely that's not right. I mean, if that happened at Holiday Club, I feel like we'd be in a lot of trouble. So why is it kind of just okay for Elisha to do this? Again, if we're looking for Elisha to be a paragon of morals, then maybe we're going to end up in a weird spot. So where are we going to land with this? Maybe this is going to fit kind of in that last category, the devotional educational one. Maybe it's just a story. Maybe we can kind of glean something about the character of Elisha. Maybe he's a bit of a grumpy guy, or maybe it's just about God being powerful enough for Elisha to snap his fingers and call bears out of the woods. I'm not quite sure what to do with it. But maybe it fits in there because it's part of the story. But I don't necessarily need to hold Elisha up as a paragon of morals, nor do I need to have this be strictly historically true for my faith to have a foundation. So I'll kind of fit it there. And this is why when people ask me what my favorite Bible passage is, I hesitate to say this one because it's kind of a weird one that we don't know what to do with. But do you see how what you go into the text looking for will often shape, it will definitely shape what you come out of with, or what you come out of the text with. And so I think that's the important part of method and what we're looking at and what we're talking about with that. You have to be conscious, first, of context, and then second, what is our method? What are we going into the text looking for? Because that will definitely shape what we come out of, or what, I can't say that, what we come out of the text with. So that's my spiel on method. The resource I have for you guys is another Bible Project video. It's just one video this time, and it's about characters in the Bible. So it fits into this story of Elisha really quite well because it talks about what are we to do with all of these morally flawed characters in the Bible and the temptation to kind of hold them up as perfect examples of how to be people of faith. And that's a temptation we have. But I think this video does a really good a good job of handling how we interpret characters in the Bible. So that's your homework for that. Thanks for joining us this week. Next week, we'll tackle a bit of what are the problems in biblical interpretation. What are the difficulties? I think that'll be a really interesting one. So thanks for joining us and have a lovely evening.